Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is John Halpin. I'm a senior fellow here and the co-director of the Progressive Studies program, for those of you who don't know what that is. It's a new program we started a year ago that looks at the history and intellectual foundations of progressivism and liberalism. We do a whole series of events like this, book events, training programs, other things like that. And we want to welcome you here tonight, and especially want to thank C-SPAN and Book TV for joining us and the audience for listening in. We are very honored tonight to have Bill Barnhart and Jean Schlickman, who are the authors of a great new biography, the only one in existence actually, of John Paul Stevens, called John Paul Stevens, An Independent Life. I'm not sure if 8 years ago you all considered that you would be doing a book event on the day that Justice Stevens retired. But it was it's quite timely, and we welcome both of you here. Bill is a 30-year veteran of the Chicago Tribune. Actually has a background in financial reporting and business work. Actually did work with PBS, the nightly business report. And Gene's background, he's a retired lawyer and spent 8 terms in the Illinois General Assembly. So they have deep ties to Illinois, and as we'll get into here in the background of Justice Stevens, Chicago plays a prominent role in his own intellectual development and a lot of the work he in his jurisprudence over time. So we're going to start off sort of broadly looking at some of the background of Justice Stevens, and then we're going to move into his judicial philosophy and some of the ideas around that, and then talk specifically about some illustrative cases where you really see some of this come out. So let's just start broadly for both of you. You had written a book prior to this on the former Illinois governor, Otto Kerner. What led both of you to decide to do a book on John Paul Stevens?
Bill and I spent time in the Illinois legislature. I as a state representative, Bill as a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Ultimately, or I should say subsequently, we parted. And one day I was reading the Tribune and I saw a byline. The name was Bill Barnhart. I called Bill and said, "Thank God you're alive. Thank God you're employed. Let's get together for lunch someday." He said, "Fine, let's do it." We did get together for lunch. We shared with each other what we had been doing. And I told Bill that I had been working on a biography of Otto Kerner. You may recall that Otto Kerner, in addition to being governor of Illinois, had been appointed by Lyndon Johnson as chairman of the Kerner Commission, studying riots in America's cities. He also had been appointed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, where John Paul Stevens also served. But Kerner then went to jail for alleged misconduct while he was governor. And I told Bill that because of my law practice, I wasn't able to keep up with it. And he said, "Well, I've got some time. How about if I join you?" Which he did. And Bill said, "It'll only take about a year, won't it?" Well, 10 years later, the publisher presented the book. And a couple of weeks after that, Bill and his wife, Kate, and I had dinner at our house in Indiana. And as they were leaving, someone said, "What are you going to write? Who are you going to write about next?" And without thinking, I said, "How about John Paul Stevens? He's a resident, or was a resident of Illinois, and he's known for his dissents." Bill said, "Well, that's not a bad idea, but why don't you write the justice and see what he has to say?" Which I did. And here's the response that I got from John Paul Stevens, dated July 12, 2002, 8 years ago. "The advice that you are considering a biography of me comes as a surprise. To the best of my knowledge, no one else is working on such a venture. You do not need my comment, but you may want to give consideration to the fact that Ken Minister's well-written, quote, Illinois justice, end of quote, describes an important episode of my career, and it has not exactly been a bestseller." Bill and I ignored that comment, and we decided to go ahead with it. And 8 years later, here we are.
So, Bill, spending 8 years researching Justice Stevens' life and his time on the court, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Justice Stevens that you didn't know before?
Well, in hindsight, and I think it can be said with some certainty, the very fact that John Paul Stevens was appointed to the federal court is a surprise. I don't believe it would happen today. I don't believe a man who had zero involvement in policy issues or political issues or any reputation at all on any kind of theory of the law or any kind of ideology of the law would even be considered. So I think in hindsight, that's the most surprising aspect of the story, and in my view, perhaps the most important, that it might be nice to find somebody like that again.
So let's dive into this a little bit. How, looking at the course of his entire career, how do you get someone who's a moderate to conservative Ford appointee becoming, probably not in his own terms, a real sort of dean of the liberal wing of the Supreme Court? How did that transformation occur?
Well, I can start with the statistics. There are several groups of academics who track the Supreme Court rulings of all sorts, both the major opinions and everything else, and they try to present a sort of a scorecard every year. The one that we followed had Stevens ranked as a conservative to moderate in his first 10 years, and then he began to shift in the more recent years to the point now where he and Justice Ginsburg and of course Souter at one point and so on do comprise the liberal side according to the way the scores are kept. And when you get into the weeds of the different cases, that's all a judgment call, because you can call a decision liberal or conservative depending on how you interpret it. But be that as it may, I think Gene would agree that we can trace the change, the statistical change, to the advent of the Reagan era. Some of the Reagan appointees, I think Justice Stevens, for whatever reason, found problems with their reasoning, and he began to be a little more assertive in what is now identified as the liberal court, particularly against the notions of textualism and originalism and all that sort of thing.
One of the first descriptions that we received of John Paul Stevens as to his judicial philosophy was that he had no agenda, nothing idealistic. Stevens himself considers the fact that each justice appointed during his career as a Supreme Court justice was more conservative than his predecessor, including Stevens himself, who succeeded Justice Douglas. And it's his comment that he hasn't moved, but the court has moved to the right.
Well, part of it, you spend a fair amount of the book going through his pre-court biography, his time from his childhood up into his time on the Seventh Circuit. And throughout that history, you talk a lot about his independence and his unpredictability of thought. And one of the things that's striking is how prevalent Chicago is in the shaping of his opinions about his professional life and his judicial philosophy in some ways. And I was struck by his attending. He attended when he was younger John Dewey's famous lab school at the University of Chicago, and that in many ways Stevens sort of embodies the philosophy and teachings of John Dewey. He probably wouldn't subscribe to that.
Bill taught there.
Bill
I did, briefly, but beaten.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this background in Chicago. How important was it in shaping his life and the various aspects in terms of his education, but more specifically, what happened to his father and his father's business? Tell us a bit about each of those episodes and how that shaped his later years.
Well, Gene, why don't you talk about the family business, which was quite prominent in Chicago in the 20s, and then I'll talk about the John Dewey influence.
Stevens' father and his grandfather organized two hotels in Chicago. One was the LaSalle, and the other was the Stevens Hotel, which is now known as the Conrad Hilton. This was in the 20s, And in the Depression, Stevens got into financial trouble.